Bruce George Peter Lee, born Peter Dinsdale, was convicted of 26 charges of manslaughter, making him one of Britain's most prolific serial killers in 1981. Peter Dinsdale was born on the 31st of July 1960 in Manchester, UK. His mother was a prostitute. His father, who clearly didn't care, vanished when Peter was just a baby, leaving his mother alone to raise him. She found being a single mother to Peter difficult, and Peter was given to his grandmother to raise until he was 3. When his mother remarried, they took Peter back and sent him to a special school for the physically handicapped, which he seemed to enjoy, but he did seem to have a turbulent childhood with his family. Dinsdale suffered epilepsy and had a neuromuscular condition that caused him to limp on his right leg and hold his right arm stiffly over his chest. At the age of 19, Dinsdale had a fascination for the kung fu expert Bruce Lee, who was very popular in the 70s, and he went on to have his name changed by deed poll to Bruce George Peter Lee. He managed to get a job as a labourer and did odd jobs in a meat factory. Nobody really thought much of him. They certainly didn't think of him as dangerous. Quite the opposite. They saw him as a weak individual, ridiculing him and calling him names. He became known as Daft Peter. His sexual orientation was also questioned by locals. On December the 4th, 1979, a house fire broke out on Selby Street in Hull. In the house were Mrs. Hasty and her 4 sons, 15-year-old Charles, Paul 12, Peter 8, and Thomas, who was asleep in the back bedroom. Mrs. Hasty's other 3 children, Angelina, Nicola, and Peter's twin Sophie, were staying with relatives close by for the night. Her husband was in prison at the time. While they all slept, the fire raged through the home. Eventually, Charles would wake up. He ran to his mother and forcibly pushed her through the upstairs window, saving her life. But try as he might, he couldn't get to his brothers. The aftermath of the fire left Charles with smoke inhalation and his body covered in burns. He died the next day at Pinderfields Hospital in Wakefield, Yorkshire. His brothers, Peter and Paul, fought for their lives in the Special Burns Unit. Peter died 2 days later, while Paul fought for 9 days before he also passed. Thomas survived with minor injuries. While investigating, the fire officers noticed paraffin on the porch floor and realised the fire must have been started on purpose. The police, being called, set up an investigation room and questioned many people about the family and the fire. They came to the conclusion that the family had been a little problematic in the neighbourhood, and people didn't seem that shocked that this horrific thing had happened. At the boys' joint funeral, the mother, Edith Hasty, voiced her disappointment at the lack of sympathy from the community. The 3 boys were buried together. The police had now established that this was a personal attack on the Hasty family and began looking for an arsonist. It didn't take long. An anonymous telephone call gave them a lead, and eventually Lee came forward, admitting to pouring paraffin through the letterbox and setting fire to it. He told them it was an act of revenge, as he and Charles had had an inappropriate encounter, and Charles later threatened Lee he would tell the police unless he gave him money, as Charles was a minor. But he didn't mean to kill them. While Dinsdale, or should I say Lee, was being questioned, he surprisingly confessed to 9 more fatal fires. They were all in Hull and spanned over 7 years. The fires that were mentioned were all deemed to be accidental. At the time, arson was never considered. A total of 23 people had died in the blazing fires, ranging from a 6-month-old baby, a young mother and her 3 small sons, to 11 elderly men in a residential home. Many more were burned or suffered smoke inhalation or were hurt while trying to escape. Lee later claimed that only the Hasty fire and 2 others were started because of a grudge. The others were started randomly without any concern for life, because he, as he stated, loved fire. Investigating officers then proceeded to drive Lee around the city of Hull to the locations he had mentioned in his statement. As the police needed to confirm he wasn't a fantasist, they took him to a location they knew he hadn't had anything to do with, as they already had the person responsible. When they arrived at the area, he was adamant he hadn't started that one. He wasn't responsible. And they knew this and started to believe that his statements were horrifically true. On the 20th of January 1981, Lee pleaded not guilty at Leeds Crown Court to 26 counts of murder, but guilty to 26 counts of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, and to 11 counts of arson. Also 2 counts of grievous bodily harm, as he had admitted to starting the fire that had severely burned a young mother and her daughter, but they fortunately survived. At his trial in 1981, his plea was accepted. He was ordered to be detained indefinitely under the Mental Health Act, the judge calling him a psychopath and a danger to the public. Lee was taken to Park Lane Special Hospital in Liverpool and was later transferred to Rampton Secure Hospital in Nottinghamshire. Although he was the most prolific killer in the UK at the time, he received relatively little national publicity. possibly because he was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. The trial of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, was also going on at the time, so most of the media coverage was of that very high-profile case. It could also be that he committed the crimes because he enjoyed the thrill of the raging fire, not for the kill, unlike most serial killers. There were some personal kills by Lee, like the Hasty Boys and 34-year-old David Brewer, who Lee had rowed with over pigeons days before, and Brewer had threatened Lee with a clout round the ear. Lee, being incensed by this, broke into Brewer's home. Finding him asleep in his chair, he poured paraffin over him and set light to him. Brewer ran out of his house screaming, but despite the best efforts of his neighbours, Brewer died on his way to hospital. He clipped my ear, and he shouldn't have done that, claimed Lee, who later returned to Mr. Brewer's house and wrung the necks of his pigeons one by one. A vengeful, dangerous mind. Years later, a public inquiry into the residential home fire, where 11 people had died, was conducted, and it was concluded that the fire was, after all, an accident. This was verified by the senior fire investigation officer. But Lee still claims responsibility. With Lee not being held responsible for the deaths, it led to 11 manslaughter convictions being quashed. This meant that the death toll for Lee was diminished to 15, still unnecessarily high. Lee is now in his 40th year of incarceration, having spent nearly his entire adult life in a secure institution, and he will probably never be freed. Reading books referencing Lee's crimes, his statements are horrific and show a complete lack of empathy or regard for human life, wiping out families and leaving loved ones beyond devastated, all because Lee got a tingling in my fingers and a fire in my head. Thank you for watching.